Hello, everybody. This is Leonardo Martinez-Diaz, and we're waiting for my colleague, Alice Hill. She'll be here momentarily. But in the meantime, I wanted to start by providing you with a quick introduction as to how Alice and I came to this very important challenge, and to also thank the sponsors for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to talk to all of you. When Alice and I were working in the federal government back during the Obama administration, those were there were times of very, very active effort on the climate challenge. One of the key achievements of that period was the Paris Agreement that would help create a multilateral coalition to cut emissions around the world. And even though all of that was obviously a historically important work, we sensed that there wasn't enough attention being placed on the need to develop and build resilience against the impacts of climate change. Of course, we've always felt that the best resilience policy is cutting emissions. There is no adapting to a 4-degree world or worse, of course. So we have to do that. But at the same time, it's very important that we also begin to build resilience, because there are some impacts that may be unavoidable given the heating that has already happened and some of the emissions that already are in the atmosphere. And so it is responsible and incumbent upon us to begin planning for that and to invest in resilience today, given that we already are starting to see some of those impacts from climate change and exacerbated by climate change. And so Alice and I, after a period of time, decided that we had to write a book to help raise awareness and to, above all, help combat what we see as an increasingly kind of apocalyptic type of narrative, where it's very difficult to cope with these impacts. And I know it can feel very overwhelming. Just over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen record wildfires in the West. We've seen in 2017, for example, the first time that 4 Category 3 hurricanes hit the U.S. mainland in a single year. Historic flooding in the Midwest, and of course, continued floods in the East. And I know this can be very overwhelming, but what we wanted to do in the book is to show that there are things we can do, and that indeed there are communities and there are leaders that already are putting in place investments to help their communities be more resilient to these impacts. And so the book showcases many of those quiet heroes, if you will, who are working to build resilience around the country. And so very happy to have my colleague Alice join. And let me just close my introduction here by saying that we wanted to have a book that was at once realistic and unflinching about the challenges we face, but also that could provide lots of examples, real life examples, including many from Florida, about folks who are working hard to prepare their communities, who are making the investments and who are putting together the political coalitions necessary to build more resilience. Let me pass it over to Alice, who can tell us a bit more from her perspective why it was so important to write this book.
Well, thank you, Leo. And I apologize for my late appearance. I think that the technology during COVID is testing my resilience. So I had a little glitch here, but I'm really glad to have a chance to speak with you today, simply because I'm such an admirer of all the work that the state of Florida has done in a variety of contexts: insurance, building resilience to storm surge, understanding flood risk, really some remarkable progress that all of the country can look to as it tries to deal with these worsening impacts from climate change. But the reason why I got interested in climate change is that as I handled an assignment that was given to me in the Obama administration to prepare the first ever adaptation plan for the Department of Homeland Security, this huge, sprawling federal agency with 200,000 employees that covers immigration, emergency management, the Coast Guard, a whole variety of topics, including fighting terrorism. So we needed to question whether that department, the Department of Homeland Security, had to think about preparing for the impacts of climate change. When we started looking at what deeper droughts would mean, what greater storm surge, hotter temperatures, and more intense storms would bring for all of the mission spaces within the department, we realized we needed to care deeply. As I worked on that, I met Leo when I moved over to the White House, but it became clear to me that most others in the policymaking world hadn't had the privilege of really talking to the scientists about what's ahead, so that they could understand that we need to take action now to prepare for the future events that will occur as a result of more heating. So as you ponder what will all of this additional warming bring, you begin to see that it threatens our systems. So our underlying systems, for example, in the built environment, where and how we build matters deeply in a world of changing climate. Also, as Leo introduced me, it affects the financial system deeply. It affects the law, where I had spent a good deal of my career. The courts will be laggards in addressing the climate issues, but there will be many, many legal issues to be resolved by judges going forward. So as we looked at how deeply this would affect our systems, and I saw earlier with Dr. Holder, she was talking about migration and people on the move, our national security and our human security. Leo and I felt it's time to step back, take a little bit higher level view from a higher altitude to help people understand what's at stake, and that there are choices now that we can have to be more resilient going forward. So Leo and I thought today we'd spend a little time just interviewing each other. We haven't done that before, but to share some of the things that we have learned most recently since we wrote the book. Of course, the pandemic occurred very shortly after it was published, as well as some other additional thoughts that we've had as the world continues to heat up and we see more movement among governments and among the private sector in trying to assess risk and make choices about what to do about it going forward. So Leo, I want to ask you first, how has your thinking, if it's changed at all, changed as a result of our global experience with the catastrophic threat posed by a pandemic, in this case of COVID-19?
Well, I think it's changed things in a couple of ways. One is positive in the sense that the COVID pandemic has, I think, very graphically demonstrated the importance of forecasting, of looking around the bend, of dealing with challenges that were not unforeseeable. I think everybody, or many people, including those Ellis worked with in the federal government, understood that a pandemic was very much a question of when, not of if. And in fact, several pandemics have hit the US and other countries over the last 20 years. So the question wasn't so much whether it would happen, but rather the timing and being ready for that, having the contingency planning in place, having the capabilities to address that challenge when it hits is, I think, one of the big lessons of the pandemic, and one that is very readily applicable to climate impacts. The second is one that I think I certainly had not struggled with enough when we're writing the book. And that is the fact that we are likely going to have to cope with climate change, not in isolation or by itself, but likely in the context of other crises that may be unrelated to climate, but that are here already. Right now, for example, we see in many places that are dealing with the pandemic, with COVID, and the economic crisis that is coming along with it. Also with then hurricanes, droughts, extreme heat waves, all of the other risks that we had been focusing on. And so this means we're going to have to get a lot smarter about dealing with what's now called, compound risks or multi-peril shocks. The fact that these things are not going to come one by one at a time, giving us plenty of time to just focus on one thing. We're going to have to think about this matrix of multiple risks, and we're going to have to deal with them simultaneously in some cases. And I think that makes the challenge more complex, but it does mean that we have to be able to get our head around it in order to save lives. And then lastly, I think COVID has really underscored the importance of data, making sure that we understand in real time what is the nature of the shock, who is getting infected, what are the rates of hospitalization, what are the geographic, at a very granular level, what are the geographic impacts of the pandemic. With climate change, we have to do the same. We have to understand with great detail which communities are most likely to be impacted. How does sea level rise affect potentially different parts of the country over time and with different scenarios? We have to be able to equip communities with the capacity not just to access huge amounts of data, which they may not then be able to process, but how do we make the data decision ready? And how do we make sure that small businesses and mayors and small communities that may not have a room full of PhDs to interpret the data, that they're able to make sense of the risks they confront? And that, I think, has been brought to life by COVID. It's something we can take stock in, learn from, and then apply to climate. I wanted to turn to you, Alice, and see, we've been at this now for 10 months or so, talking about the book. I was wondering if you have been surprised by the way in which it has been received, if anything has struck you as noteworthy that you weren't expecting.
Well, I think there are two things that have surprised me. The first is that Leo and I consciously wanted to take a hopeful view as we wrote this book, because so much of climate can feel doom and gloom. But you can never know how your audience receives it. So I've had a number of people say, oh, that was so hard to hear. And I did wonder, well, if you really want to get depressed, then start reading some of the UN's reports, which are quite grim about the need for us to immediately cut our emissions, which of course we are having great difficulty doing on a global scale. So we are in for more heating and more events, and our aim was to provide solutions. The second thing that's really surprised me is how much attention climate change has gotten just in the last year. When I first got that assignment at the Department of Homeland Security, that was in 2009, if I saw a piece in a major media outlet about climate adaptation, it would just take my breath away because it was so rare. And I remember traveling out to meet with the Southeast Regional Compact, and that was thrilling to me to see all these people focused on how to do better about planning regionally for these growing threats. But those were rare experiences for me. And now we have major outlets with multiple reporters covering what's occurring. We have it appearing in national news, on the radio, and internationally. Much more coverage about events like Hurricane Zeta now hitting in southern coast, the wildfires that are occurring in the American West, and also thoughtful reporting about what that means. How does the insurance market respond to this? How can we better prepare in advance? Can communities reduce their risks together, or is it all by individuals? Really important, complex topics that need coverage. So that's been very exciting, and it's fortuitous that I feel that our book happened to get caught with that wave of renewed interest in this. Even the level that we're seeing now, in my opinion, is simply not enough. As I have spent even more time thinking about climate change, having a chance to meet with people from all walks of life, all kinds of academic disciplines, I appreciate that there still is not a great understanding that has infiltrated across the necessary silos to kind of break through and achieve the real focus on preparedness that will be required. So I know that there's plenty of work ahead, but it's been inspirational to me to see all of the thought and excitement there is about finding a better way. And certainly until we get people engaged, we can't get started on really the hard issues before. So, Leo, in your thoughts as we go forward, what do you think the government should be prioritizing right now in terms of building long-term resilience?
Well, as I'm sure many of the participants in this conference understand, adaptation and resilience are ultimately local issues, right? Because climate change affects every community in a very particular way, depending on the characteristics of that community, the geography, the socioeconomic structures in place, and so on. Ultimately, resilience solutions have to have the participation and the voice and the acceptance of those communities in order to really work. And so the federal government can play a role in that process, in facilitating it, in catalyzing it. I was recently in Seattle, Washington, and speaking to the folks who are helping the state of Washington come up with coastal protection programs. And I asked them point blank, what do you think the federal government can do to help? And they said, look, we've invested a lot of time and effort in building the technical solutions here for coastal protection, in getting those sold to local city councils and to mayors and to communities, putting together the right packages. The federal government can help by not interfering with that, letting us do our thing, but then providing in a very surgical way funding and information that can help catalyze those efforts. And so when things are working, I think the federal government ought to let those efforts continue, but provide targeted financing, especially grant financing, that can help develop different types of scoping studies or feasibility, proof of concept exercises, try to allow communities to experiment with what is most likely to work. The other thing the federal government can do is to build a strong backbone of what we call public goods, right? The most important of which is information and data and modeling. Basically, the resources that can help communities understand the risks they're facing. Back during, about 5-6 years ago, the Government Accountability Office put together a study of the weather and climate data system we have here in the United States at the federal level. And it concluded that largely that system isn't working as well as it should, that it's too fragmented, it's too difficult, even for the federal policymakers to get that information. And so we need to think from the bottom up how to ensure that system is working better and how we are providing that information, again, in a decision-ready way to folks all across the system. And finally, the private sector has to play a key role. It doesn't matter if a large corporation spends millions of dollars turning their facilities, their factories, their supply chains into climate resilient systems. If the public infrastructure around that factory, around that business fails, if folks can't get to work, if consumers can't receive the goods, suppliers can't deliver their products, those companies will also suffer. And so what we need are unprecedented levels of collaboration and dialogue between businesses and local communities and mayors and local city councils and the state governments as well. And those kinds of dialogues that can lead to some joint solutions on which they both depend is something that the federal government can help facilitate. Alice, you've spent, as you pointed out early on, a lot of time thinking about the built environment. In Florida, obviously, a lot of the dialogue is about sea level rise, about hurricanes, about coastal property. The first chapter in our book is all about learning how to build better and more resiliently. What was the main insight that you got from writing that chapter?
Well, I think that the federal government has in two major ways failed state and local governments. The first is that it has, as you've said, Leo, not provided them the necessary data and information for them to be able to understand their risks going forward, to be able to identify the locations that will be at high risk, as well as ways to better build, better think through how infrastructure works together, the interdependencies, to build a more resilient community. And because communities don't have the data, they sometimes make some choices that in hindsight are not going to be wise because they have continued to put people at risk. That's partially because we create flood maps that don't currently, for the most part, accurately reflect future flood risk. And they suggest that if you're outside the line that's drawn on the map, you're somehow safe from flooding. We don't have wildfire maps for the United States. And in the absence of that kind of information or a requirement that risk is disclosed, people go into buying their most important investments, typically in their lives, fairly blind. They simply don't know what's ahead. The federal government has also, because it has since really President Eisenhower flipped its model of giving aid. Before World War II, communities were pretty much on their own in terms of disaster recovery. It fell to nonprofits, the Red Cross and others to assist communities from climbing out of a disaster. But after World War II and in the 1950s, Congress started giving more and more aid. And over time, that percentage is now 70%. And in some instances where there's a really big event, it can be 100% that the federal government is underwriting after a big event. The problem with that approach is that the state and local governments are the ones who make the decisions about where people live and how they build. And because we're not giving those communities accurate information about what the risks are, and it's difficult for them to determine, they are continuing to permit building in risky places and buildings that may not be as safe as they can be. Now, of course, after Hurricane Andrew, the state of Florida enacted the, I think, the strongest wind-resistant building code we have in the United States, which was a model of reacting in the face of a disaster to build back better. But that isn't systematically happening across the nation, and the risks are continuing to accumulate without currently a building code that addresses future risks. That does not exist yet in the International Code Council's building codes, or really any other model building codes. So even if communities adopt the latest building code, and FEMA estimates that only 30% of communities around the nation adopt a disaster resistant code, so most are not, we get building that will not withstand these events, and then the federal government comes in and bails these communities out. Our government watchdog, the Government Accountability Office, has said that is just not a sustainable practice long term. It will not keep us safe. It will just increase damages over time. So we need to pull back. That's my greatest learning from all of this. We need to pull back and examine what could provide the necessary incentives to improve the decision-making on the ground. As Leo has said, climate change impacts come in locally, and we need to help local communities understand the choices that they're making by putting development in areas that will be either underwater or burned in the near future. And if the risks continue to accelerate, we'll see a situation similar to what Florida has had to work through. We'll see insurers decide that perhaps that's not a market they want to continue in. In fact, a very similar situation is unfolding right now in California, where insurers are facing unprecedented risk from wildfire and saying, you know, maybe we don't need to write so much property insurance here in California going forward. The state is struggling to figure out, as Florida did, how can we work with the insurers to make sure that they don't leave the state. These are the challenges that we need to do better on, And I think the federal government can lead by shifting the paradigm to focus on risk reduction in advance of disaster rather than disaster recovery. So Leo, I want to ask you, since I've just talked a lot about money and how we pay for these disasters, how are we going to pay for resilience?
And I think a lot of folks around the table here, as it were, are thinking about the same question. Ultimately, communities only have so much money in their tax revenues. There's only so much you can borrow from the markets, even these days when borrowing is cheap for those who can't afford it. So ultimately, I think the question is, how are we going to pay for all of this? Even as we see that we're going to need a long and sustained period of investing in climate resilience. In the book, we have a whole chapter on this question. And I think ultimately, it boils down to a combination of doing more with the money we have now. In other cases, to find new ways to fund some of this infrastructure, and also to find ways to more effectively avoid bad choices, right? Which is also another way of saving money. Let me just walk you through some of those for the sake of the audience here. The first is, how do we do more with what we have? So right now we are rebuilding from the pandemic. As we do that, and eventually I'm sure there'll be additional federal dollars going into communities to help them deal with COVID and to help build back better. And that will mean putting in place some infrastructure and some systems that can help us not just with pandemics, but perhaps we can also do the same with climate. Take, for example, what Houston has done with its healthcare infrastructure. In Houston, there's one of the most important hubs of healthcare facilities in the country. What they did after severe flooding is they invested in retrofitting their structures to make sure that they could continue to function even during a major storm. And so when Hurricane Harvey hit in 2017, dumping 50 inches of rain on the city, the Houston's healthcare facilities were able to continue operating because of those resilient features that had been put in place. In the same California, we need to be able to have healthcare facilities that can operate even when there's smoke outside from wildfires. And even small developing countries are investing in hurricane-proof hospitals and treatment centers. So as we think about what to do with that $1 of COVID, prevention and pandemic prevention money, can we also think of ways to ensure that we are investing in climate resilience as well as providing healthcare surge capacity for the future? So that's one thing we need to do. Can we use that $1 for multiple uses? The second is we are going to need more money. Miami, I think, recognized this early on. You have the Miami Forever bonds that help raise hundreds of millions of dollars for water management and coastal protection. And I'm afraid we're going to have to do more of that. There is really no way around that. But of course, the overall long-term, the costs of building resilience and avoiding damages almost inevitably exceed the costs of investing today in resilience. And the other thing is it's not a one-stop shop type of thing. You have to think about a sustained period of investment. And that's why issuing bonds like the Miami Forever bonds are a good idea, because they provide funding that can be spaced out over multiple years for long-term projects. And finally, we have to not do stupid things, right? In other words, if we see bad investments, for example, in structures, in infrastructure or commercial property that is at very high risk, as Alice was saying earlier, we got to have ways to discourage that type of construction. We got to have ways to protect the government, which ultimately becomes the insurer of last resort. If the private insurers decide to not write insurance there, as Alice was saying, or they pull out of the market, it can just fall on the ultimately in the public. And so we have to figure out how to discourage those types of investments. I'm looking here at the questions on the side here, and I was wondering, Alice, if you'd consider entertaining this question about FEMA, asking about, well, what's it going to take to have some flood maps that are up to date? I know this is something you've thought about. People, like, it's pretty compelling, right, that we should have maps that are up to speed, but we know there's politics behind that. We know there's red tape, perhaps. What's holding it back?
Well, it's very expensive. For one thing, the modeling takes a lot of money, and it is complex. So there are some technical hurdles to maps, and Congress has not funded this sufficiently for FEMA to produce the maps. And that means that there are significant portions of the United States, not along the coastlines, but riverine flooding, stream flooding, that are simply not mapped by FEMA yet. So just can't get that information. But two things have happened. The first is that First Street Foundation, a private foundation, and I think it's an NGO, was funded by a very wealthy individual, a philanthropist, to produce flood maps for every address in the United States. So you can go on their website and look at the flood risk for your home. You type in your address and it will show you the flood risk for your home, including future flood risk from climate change. There's a question how will be funded going forward, as the modeling has to continue as we experience more heating. But it is a major gift to the United States for individuals to understand their own personal flood risk. I think that another thing that has happened is that FEMA has realized that the way the flood maps are drawn, they might give a false impression to individuals who fall out of the flood zone. We found in these very big events like Harvey and Sandy, many homes were flooded that were well beyond the 100-year flood mark. So even calling it a 1 in 100-year flood can cause people to feel some diminishment of risk. Because, of course, with climate change, the likelihood of flooding is probably increasing. So it may be the 1 in 75-year flood in terms of probability, but if it's New York, it'll get down to the 1 in 25-year flood in the not too distant future. So FEMA has realized that the way it's set up, and the reason why it uses this terminology, this lexicon, is because of the National Flood Insurance Program. So I think that they want to think through what they can do to have better results. One challenge they face is that people don't like it when the new flood maps come out and it says your home is in the flood plain. They don't like that, because they think it reduces their property value. So this makes it very contentious and makes it even slower for FEMA to be able to roll out new maps. It's a big challenge. Maps are viewed, I think, fairly universally as a very effective tool for conveying risk going forward. So we do need to pay attention to this, and whether it's going to be through private philanthropy or some other means, the nation needs a good set of flood risk maps that include future risk. So I want to turn to you now, Leo, and I'm going to ask you this question. What resilience would you support? What resilience measure would you support first for investment?
I think what we need the most is, well, I'm going to say two things, not just one. One is more systems that can help communities figure out the answer to that question. And it's not a cop-out. It really is important, because the answer of what is the first priority is going to depend on the community and what kinds of risks they're facing in that particular locality. And also, what solutions could that community get behind? And in many places, you have your proverbial dollar to spend on resilience, and it's not at all clear if that dollar should go to build a seawall, to put in more pumps, to pump out the water from the subsoil, to move people to help buy out some properties that are at high risk and encourage those folks to be able to relocate to safer ground. You can only do so much with a single dollar, right? And so how do you deploy it? And then it's not obvious what the answer is. It depends on lots of things. So putting in place a process that, as somebody else said here on the comments column, that engages the community, the civic engagement, that does the hard numbers as well, that puts on the table the science and the technical aspects of the various options. And also that tells us what are the equity implications, right, of those investments. All those things have to be put in place, and that conversation and the equipment to have that conversation in an effective way is the first thing I would prioritize here. The other thing I would do is to invest more in protecting the most vulnerable. Consider, for example, that as we were writing this book, we looked at a lot of the statistics coming out of Katrina, which was in some ways one of the big wake-up calls about climate impacts. And consider that in New Orleans, 70% of the people who perished during that event were age 60 or over, even though that group was only 15%, of the overall population. So the elderly found themselves disproportionately suffering, dying from the event. And so we have to figure out, how do we identify those groups that are most likely to be affected first? And there's all kinds of ways to do it now. In the book, we talk, for example, about incipient efforts to use artificial intelligence. For computers will cross-tabulate, crunch a whole bunch of different kinds of numbers and databases, and then help the authorities figure out where the most vulnerable people might be, so that we can check up on them, for example, in the advent of a heat wave or a major event. Anything that can help the community mobilize ahead of time, before the event actually hits, and save lives that way is going to be really crucial. Just looking here at what folks are saying, there's I think concerns about how do you disincentivize rebuilding in dangerous places, or building there in the first place. We have, I think, as you'll recall in our book, Alice, some pictures of some rather expensive property built on some really, really scary land. And so, of course, we can be tough and say, well, we're not going to support people who build here. But in practice, how do you think that that works? How do we provide the right disincentives?
Well, it is a huge problem, because once it's built, then we have to figure out how we're going to help people move from there to get out of the way, out of harm's way. So a number of things. The best of all is that they never build there in the first place. And we do have one very powerful example in the United States, the Coastal Barriers Resource Act, which was passed in the 1960s. It basically said, along some of our very fragile barrier islands, the federal government would no longer support development in those areas. So if the community or a household wants to go ahead and build there, that's fine. But the federal government is not going to support that construction. I think that we should apply that principle more broadly, in that we shouldn't be subsidizing loans. We shouldn't be providing federal assistance to build in areas that we know are at known risk. Of course, we need better maps to be able to determine that. But I think it's very clear that one way the federal government can help nudge a better approach to this is simply to say that unless building is done in a climate resilient way, or a resilient way, in consideration of the risks, federal taxpayer dollars are not going to support that. So we're not going to ask the people of Minnesota to support the development in California of areas that are at extreme fire risk, when we know that fire risk is going up. People can still choose to do this, but it won't be on the taxpayer's dime. One way Canada is doing this is they have a one and done policy. They offer you a single buyout. A disaster happens. They give you $100,000, $200,000. Say you can stay in your home or you can leave, but we're not going to help you again. And I think we need to help people get out of harm's way. Certainly for those who can least afford it, I think we all will need to pitch in and make sure that we can relocate those folks successfully and buy out their homes in a way that they can move forward. But for any new development, the federal government should not be the ones giving the financial support to get it started. We want to stop people from investing in areas at known risk. But we see it in huge amounts in our coast, Atlantic coast, Connecticut and New Jersey. I think it's in the last 10 years have seen more development in the floodplain than outside of it. Given that the federal government ends up paying 70 to 90% of the disaster recovery costs, sometimes 100%, that's not sustainable. So we need to find ways to encourage people to not invest in risk from the get-go, but rather to make a safer choice as they decide where and how to live. So Leo, I will ask you what I think will be our last question. And let me see. Let's see if I can get one here. Can you tell us a little bit about why we see such varied impacts coming and what it will mean if we had a green recovery and could get our emissions to zero tomorrow?
Sorry, could you rephrase?
Well, if we got our emissions to zero tomorrow, would we still see climate impacts coming in to around the world? And why do these climate impacts come in so unequally around the world?
Well, I mean, part of it is that just the physics of global warming, right? That we see different parts of the world heating up at different rates. The farther north you go, the faster that warming appears to be happening. Just the other day, I had a chance to talk to a Canadian group of insurers, and looking at their equivalent of the National Climate Assessment, it's clear that Canada is experiencing warming on average that is twice as fast as that in the rest of the world. So in other places, of course, sea level rise is happening more quickly. And so that's the reality of climate impacts, is they are not even. One thing we do know, however, is that they often affect the countries that are, and the places, the communities that are least likely or least able to adapt. There is now an increasing literature of studies that show what they're calling climate gentrification. That is to say, the areas where the poorest people live, in many cases, are the ones that are getting affected by these impacts first, and therefore the values of the properties dropping even further. And property that is on a more elevated, more resilient location is appreciating faster. And so over time, you can see how this could lead to some very significant inequality, with wealthier folks moving to places that are more resilient and leaving behind those that cannot afford to get out of dangerous areas. And that's, I think, a real problem. One of the folks here on the chat column here is asking, well, what about, how do we disincentivize for this private development? And one of the key questions I think that remains for me is, how will the private markets react to climate impacts? You mentioned insurance, Alice, but it's not just insurance, right? We are seeing the price of property already begin to reflect, in some cases, the risk of floods and wildfires. Eventually, we're going to see, I think, more disclosure on the part of companies and municipalities that issue bonds and stocks, so that folks in the market buying and selling these assets are going to start to pay a premium for investing in companies that are more exposed to climate change, or investing in municipalities that are not doing enough to build resilience. And all of this is going to send a big signal to the market, perhaps in a way that government can't, or perhaps more quickly than government can, to say, look, don't invest here. This is a dangerous area. Or to reward those that are taking the risk seriously and are taking action to build resilience. And so that is going to be a really important part of our solution. But we have to be aware that when the markets do eventually react to climate impacts, it's going to come very quickly. And we have to be able to adapt quickly and to ensure that those that are least able to adapt are able to do so by prioritizing their protection.
Well, thank you. Great words to end on. And thank you for giving us this chance to speak with you all today. It's really been a thrill, and you have a great program. So we'll let you go now. So thank you so much.